Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm Andy Parsons, Senior Director of the Content Authenticity Initiative here at Adobe. Our team focuses on three things: open standards for content provenance, which we'll be discussing today, in a sister organization called the C2PA and the Linux Foundation. We work on open source code, which many of you are using to do your provenance implementations, implementing the specification, deploying this idea, of course, across the Adobe Creative Cloud, and most importantly, building community, which all of you are part of today. So what are we talking about when we say provenance? You'll hear this referred to in many ways: content credentials, provenance, authenticity, transparency. We really think this refers to three simple ideas. One, that consumers should be able to make informed decisions about the media, where it came from, what it is, in some cases, who made it. That trust is between humans, and trust signals should be carried along with the media itself, no matter where it goes. And lastly, that creators should be able to get credit for their work and provide transparency to their audiences. So I want to quickly highlight a few things that have happened since our last event. Some very exciting times. Obviously, we're living through a tidal wave of generative AI developments. The team released the 1.3 C2PA specification a few weeks ago. Specifically has a few highlights related to generative AI, including the ability to provide AI transparency in a structured way, and also a do not train metadata tag that allows creators to express their intent for generative AI training purposes. It also includes support for new file formats, which many of you are already aware of, including WebP and Wave for professional audio. Just yesterday, Adobe shipped a version of Lightroom that has content credentials built into it. So you can now use this in Adobe products, including Photoshop, Lightroom, Behance, Adobe Stock, and most recently Firefly, a generative AI model that we have deployed. I want to highlight that we now have over 1,000 members in the CAI, which is really exciting. We started with 3 back in 2020. As always, this is a symbol and a testament to the urgency that we all feel around transparency and trying to address some of the problems of misinfo, disinfo, and transparency. I'm not going to take any more time before I introduce our wonderful moderator today, Claire Leibowitz. If you've been in and around the generative AI space or AI in general over the last few years, you have surely encountered Claire in one capacity or another. Claire is the head of the AI and Media Integrity Program at the Partnership on AI, where she's worked since the organization's inception. Under her leadership, the AI and Media Integrity team creates best practices for the development and deployment of AI technologies that impact media and online information in collaboration with over 100 partners from across civil society, academia, industry, and media. Aside from generative AI, the program focuses on responsible recommender systems, misinfo interventions, and the sustainability of local news. And if you haven't encountered Claire on a personal basis, you've certainly read some of her writings, which are always insightful. In 2021, Claire was a journalism fellow at Tablet Magazine, where she explored questions at the intersection of digital culture, tech, and society. And Claire's insights have appeared publicly in publications including Axios, MIT, Tech Review, Wired Magazine, The Hill. She advises companies, governments, and nonprofit organizations on AI governance, Gen AI, and digital media. I personally had the privilege of working with Claire on the PI Media Integrity Steering Committee and their responsible practices for synthetic media, which was released a few months ago. And that document and all the work that we've done together does, in fact, feature disclosure and provenance quite prominently. So I can't think of a better person to lead us through some of these very complex issues and lend her own very well-considered insights today than Claire Leibowitz. Claire.
Thanks, Andy, so much for that introduction and for your leadership in growing the CAI, C2PA, and all the provenance efforts in the field. So to spend just 2 more minutes describing, I guess, the aperture which I approach these challenges from, which will be a good segue into our conversation and introducing our panelists. The Partnership on AI, we're a global multi-stakeholder nonprofit devoted to the huge mandate of responsible AI. And our origin story conveys the importance of multidisciplinarity and cross-sector collaboration in dealing with these challenges around AI development and also the furthering of truth and creativity and other values we all hold dear. We were founded by the heads of AI research at some of the largest technology companies: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, DeepMind, IBM, Microsoft, and Google, based on this sense that all of the challenges that AI and opportunities it affords for society not only transcend any of their interests or institutions, but also sectors. So we work with journalists, media, other prongs of industry to create best practices, like the responsible practices for synthetic media, the mouthful that Andy just conveyed that launched a month and a half ago. And that was the result of over a year of drafting with over 100 institutions, and resulted in basically a tech policy on how to do synthetic media responsibly, which is generated content that appears real and can be audio or visual, and to an average viewer might replicate events or persons or other features. And what was notable about that effort, which we launched with 10 partners, including Adobe a little over a month ago, OpenAI, Adobe, Bumble, TikTok, the BBC, CBC, Witness, the video and human rights nonprofit, and 3 startups, is the extent to which we want to capture all the ecosystem's insights, and that document tailors recommendations to builders of technology, to creators and distributors, who we see as all playing a role in this responsible moment in generative AI. So that's a perfect segue for me to introduce our panelists, a creator who's building with this technology, and someone else who's working at the infrastructure level to create the tools to develop generative AI. And we are going to dive into all these thorny questions with them in a second. But first, we have Jean Kogan, who's an artist and the co-founder of Eden, and also a programmer who's interested in autonomous systems, collective intelligence, and generative art. He created ML4A, a free book about machine learning for arts, and even catalyzed the Abraham Project, which creates an autonomous artist. So we're looking forward to hearing about all the things he's been creating with Gen AI. And then we have Tom Mason, the CTO of Stability AI, an organization that maximizes or seeks to maximize the accessibility of modern AI to inspire global creativity and innovation. He leads the engineering division for the platform and its infrastructure. Previously, he was CTO at Chorus Intelligence, a global data platform for law enforcement, and formerly founded a tech accelerator called USoft. So with that in mind, with these kind of 3 different perspectives on the field, I'd love for each of our panelists, starting with Tom, to share how you understand your role in the Gen AI ecosystem and the main challenges and opportunities your sector or organization is facing.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the intro, Claire, and it's great to be here. Thank you for the invite. We're really excited to work with Adobe on this project and be a part of it. I've been at Stability just over a year now, and it's been an incredible ride. The whole generative industry is obviously accelerating hugely, and we released Stable Diffusion back end of last year, and our kind of background, our ethos is really about kind of 3 things. First and foremost, we're an open source company, and so we have got a huge commitment to transparency and telling everyone how we do things and giving those tools away. That allows people to verify, the performance and the risks of the software. Obviously, we do it in a way that's equitable, which is really important as this industry is evolving so quickly. That we give the tools away so that people of all types, of all backgrounds, can use the models, and they don't have to be part of some big organization. And then obviously security, and having the ability for companies, organizations of all types to fine tune those models and build on top of them and develop tooling on top of them. So Stable Diffusion has kind of been our first big release last year, and we're following that up with language models and all kinds of other things that are coming soon down the line. So it's been an incredible year, and we're really honored to be part of that momentum of revolution that's going on, and looking forward to the future.
Jean, do you want to follow up as a creator, how you've been thinking about Gen AI and challenges and opportunities?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you also for the invitation. It's really great to be here, and this topic is very near and dear to my heart. So my background, I've been working in generative AI for almost a decade now, so I'm kind of a fossil in this space. I'm sort of pre-GANs and certainly pre-text to pre-language models and so on. I've been I've been interested in generative art more generally, and kind of how AI overlays onto that. I worked for a long time as an educator, do a lot of workshops. I just had one here the other day in Toronto. And basically, I'm been focused on helping other creators really understand this technology, to really take interest in it, because it's a really it's just an interesting for its own sake technology, and also just how to apply it to the things that they care about. I thought a lot about what it means to be a creator in the age of AI. There's kind of it has, of course, it's very similar in certain ways to traditional art and creativity. A lot of the intangible things are kind of timeless, but the distance from being a creator to a curator to just like an innocent bystander caught in the training data set is like rapidly collapsing. There's a lot of challenges to interfacing with this technology if you're new to it. There's of course technical challenges, and then it's just a very rapidly advancing field, and so sometimes for creators it's hard to even know how to get started. And my interest is really trying to help people really learn how to adapt it and empower themselves with it, because it's a very powerful technology. Shouldn't be afraid of it. Can really be very empowering, I would say. The provenance issue is, of course, also very of interest to me. I've been thinking a lot about, this kind of the complexity of attribution with machine learning models. Obviously, like a lot of these training data sets are collective knowledge, and so I think for me, there's a lot that we need to learn if we want to make responsible, kind of interesting, responsible policy and technology for creators. So that's kind of my main interest.
Thanks, Jean, and we'll dive into that more. But Andy.
Yeah, Tom and Jean made some wonderful points. I think, my role in this ecosystem and leading the CAI is to provide a foundation of transparency and trust. And, these are fraught words. We used to talk about truth. CAI provenance is not a detector of truth or a binary way to say this is real and this is not. I think even the question of what is real and what is our objective reality is very much in question now. So as we see, some would argue this has already happened. I might say it's happening in the next few weeks or months. The work that Stability is doing, Firefly at Adobe, Midjourney, so many others. The ability to create photorealistic depictions of people and places is incredibly powerful for creators. And as was already mentioned, enabling them to use this power with responsibility, like Spider-Man has said, is really important. And we think that the CAI and provenance more generally is the way to do that, or at least a very important component of that. And secondly, the negative impact of these powerful tools being democratized and falling into the hands of bad actors who want to make people appear to say and do things that they never said or did, and the impact that can have when social media amplifies it. And again, pushing that trust decision about what's real or trustworthy into the hands of the consumer, because everybody has a different worldview, is really what our mission is. And I think it's more vital than ever as we see photorealism, video realism, audio deepfakes become more and more accessible.
So to build upon that, Andy, I'm curious if you could flesh out a little bit more how we define, disclose, label generative AI content online. And just on my reflection in the framework, we differentiate between direct disclosure or methods for telling a consumer that something may have been edited or manipulated, and also indirect disclosure, which are ways to kind of bake in signals that are kind of harder to find. Can you elaborate on this whole world of labeling and disclosing for generative media?
I can. I'm happy to. This is a little bit like the professor asking the TA to teach the class. Claire is a deep expert on the stuff, and she and I have had many conversations about it. The notion of indirect and direct disclosure, I think, is very interesting, and I'm really glad that this is the approach that was taken in the PAI framework. Direct disclosure are some interventions that you've seen, experiments on Twitter and Meta and other social media platforms, where there's an actual visible label You saw a lot of this probably during the peak of the COVID crisis, where something might be misinforming, might be deliberately, disinformation, and the ability to say this is probably not correct. Here's a valuable source where you can get good information. Disclosing that something is meant to be satirical directly, like in text or in a very obvious way. Indirect disclosure is more of the provenance idea, at least kind of the foundational provenance idea, that if you want to know more, this media has around it, near it, in it, some additional information that will provide transparency so that you can make up your own mind. And of course, that means that media platforms, social media, stock agencies, news organizations have to not only deploy provenance technology, but also make sure that wherever that media shows up, that indirect disclosure can effectively become direct disclosure if somebody wishes to learn more about what these things are. I think both are needed. I think we're still very much learning. I suspect you would agree, Claire, which of these is most effective, and more nuanced and probably critically important is how they can be used in concert together to provide consumers the information they need without, taking something that is obviously satirical and saying, hey, this is satire. We don't want to go that far probably, but there are many harms and concerns and potential threats in using disclosure in negative ways that we have to be very careful about as well. So I think the PI framework goes a long way towards describing a foundational model for how disclosure should occur. But candidly, we still have a lot to learn as a society and as implementers of these technologies about what's effective.
And Jean, as a creator, I'll ask you, have you thought about disclosing the use of these tools in your creation? How do you think about that? How does that part of your creative process, if at all?
Yeah, for the longest time, I've been just experimenting with open source models, dating back to things like DCGAN and StyleGAN. So there's always disclosure. It's often, for me, a lot of my work is actually about the machine learning process rather than necessarily as much like the aesthetic outputs as maybe for some other artists. So certainly that's been part of it. Now I've been working on Eden, which is a platform for creators, and to me one of the things that we're kind of most interested in is really how to make inroads and connections to other projects. I've been, like many people, I've been really just kind of inspired by the post-release of Stable Diffusion. I've never seen so many people doing what I do as I've seen in the last year, and I think a lot of that really comes from the open source release of Stable Diffusion. And being someone who's making a platform, we don't intend to do everything, and so I'd like to be able to kind of find ways of interacting with others, with other creators, other platforms that maybe specialize in other ways, and actually having some kind of a positive sum interaction with those. And so, like, as I mentioned earlier, provenance is really a big principle for that.
And Tom, do you want to follow up from the vantage point of stability AI and Stable Diffusion? How do you all think about it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, no, it's been obviously it's been an incredible 6 months, and the open source release kind of powered this whole adoption, and communities doing incredible things with the tool, which has just been a joy to watch every day, and see Twitter kind of coming alive with these things that are almost impossible to keep up with. So at Stability, obviously we're providing the open source models, but also we obviously provide infrastructure and platforms for people to come and use them at scale. And what we've seen over the last 6 months is that the models not only have got much quicker and kind of order of magnitude quicker through different improvements such as optimization and just working with the way that the models generate images. That's led to its own kind of evolution or revolution of the tools that are built on top of it. But we're also seeing the aesthetic quality of the images getting better at an amazing rate, and this is because with the explosion of the community that's been created around it, people are finding out how to tune the model, make it better, bring new data to it, and fundamentally just to improve the quality of the outputs. And that's leading to this kind of convergence point where we see photorealism being something that comes out of the models on almost a exclusively constant basis, right? Where every image that you create, even with simple prompts, comes out and looks photorealistic, if that's the style you're going for. So, you know, we're seeing it being adopted by journalists in news articles, and we're seeing it being adopted by artists as an augmentation for their process. We're seeing it being adopted by all kinds of users in that creative workflow. So what we think is really important as we reach that convergence point is that it's possible for the users and the companies that adopt the platform to opt into a platform which gives the consumer of the image the identification and the knowledge of the provenance of the image. And for us, that means to be able to discern whether it's synthetic or not synthetic. This is for us the key factor, right? Is that as we reach this moment, that the tools make it possible for creators to take that responsibility on themselves, and with one click of a button, say, yes, this is a synthetic image. It doesn't mean having to introduce your artist name. It doesn't mean you have to introduce your prompts, etc. But you have that option to introduce provenance into the image, and that's what we see as a kind of really important responsibility that we have to enable. And the AI is the platform that we've chosen to do that through. It's the kind of the leading example of that, and we're really excited to adopt it.
Yeah, if I may just jump in there, Gene and Tom make great points. One useful metaphor here is nutrition labeling, right? Until there's legislation that required nutrition labels, you could disclose whatever you liked to inform your consumers, food consumers, whatever, what you were making. And there may be legislation down the road, I think we'll probably talk about this later, that does something similar for provenance if it's required and governments deem it required. But in the meantime, transparent voluntary disclosure like a nutrition label to simply say, I may want to choose to eat this sugary food in moderation or use it for a purpose that I deem reasonable for my family. But at the baseline, I need to know what it is before I make that decision. And I think we're all aligned on that being, what we're trying to accomplish.
And I'll add, I guess, to use moderator's prerogative, an anecdote that reminds us that it's a lot of human beings making judgments of these nutrition labels. And a few years ago, a colleague of mine at the time, who's now at Google, Emily Saltz and Claire Wardle, did a user study of folks across the political spectrum in the United States to ask them their reaction to those platform labels that Andy talked about during the pandemic, in particular, the one that said manipulated media. And one fellow, it's such a potent example, he said he thought that Twitter was trying to tell him the media was manipulating him, as in the media, the institution. And I use this example often just as a reminder that people are bringing to bear their own perspectives on these labels and the institutions deploying them, but that doesn't mean we should ignore transparency and experiment with these labels to figure out the best way to meet people where they are. So Tom, you said something interesting. You talked about your systems augmenting the artistic process. And earlier, Gene was saying, this potential new world for how we conceptualize creativity. How do you think about this threshold between, using Gen AI to assist or augment the creative process and also kind of these tools actually making or being creative themselves? And maybe we'll start with you, Gene, as an artist.
Yeah, certainly there's a lot of tools that are very much intended to be used as a kind of an amplifier in a human artist's creativity. It's really, amazingly easy to draft and to prototype ideas very quickly, to kind of look for inspiration and the recombinations of different things. And so I definitely see tools as the kind of predominant category, assistive tools as the sort of predominant category that's here. I'm also, there's kind of this, it's a harder case to make, that there's almost a latent, very unique kind of creativity coming from these models themselves. To me, they're kind of, compressing sometimes billions of people's knowledge. And so there's something very special about what's coming out of them. It feels almost like a window into some collective unconscious or collective imagination. And to me, it's a bit different. And so one of the things you mentioned, my Abraham project, which is very much about this, I'm really kind of interested in what these models, what they reveal to us about ourselves. And so, but it's not necessarily a dichotomy. There's certainly kind of you can almost think of as the collective imagination as your muse. You can really get a lot of ideas in that way. And so yeah, I would say there's a lot of potential for both of these. And I think the most in demand thing right now certainly is tools for creators. Creators are the people we look to make creative objects, human creators. And so it makes a lot of sense that we should, focus on really improving them and really making them kind of, fit to society in the ways that we need.
Tom or Andy, any thoughts on this augmentation or supplanting of creativity and human creation?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think certainly it's an assist, right? I mean, there's something creative in all of us, without a doubt. And I can't draw. My family were artists, but I've never had the ability to put pen to paper and to draw, and that's always been a fascinating thing for me. And this is something that's made it possible for me to experience the joy of creativity, which for me personally is one of the reasons I love this technology. That's just an incredibly magical thing if you've never had that ability before. So there is, part of this idea that making it open source democratizes it is really deeply important to what we're trying to do. But fundamentally it grows. We hope it grows the pie. It allows more people to be creative and to incorporate that into the way they work or the way they create media instead of consuming media, right? That's a big thing. Like this idea that maybe there's a transition as a society for us away from being consumers of media to being creators of media, which I've always loved the idea of. And so yeah, it just kind of lowers the barriers for people to get into that space and to enjoy it, which hopefully is something that brings joy to all. And we hopefully, I mean, in the early days I haven't been in this industry for as long as Gene, but in the early days when I was getting into this technology, the people that I was hanging out with on open source communities and Discord groups, were artists. They were people who wanted to be artistic with the tools. So I've always believed it's an assist. Yeah.
Andy,
and I'll just add, I agree with those points. The notion that rising tide lift all boats. I think that's probably correct, but frankly, I think we have to see that play out. So as people like Tom, who, no offense, can't draw, you just said that, who might not have regarded himself as an artist, can be an artist. What happens to the top end? What happens to real practitioners of art with decades of experience? How do they embrace the technology? Do they embrace the technology, or are they resentful of it? So at Adobe, we see a lot of both kind of sides of the emotional spectrum, but more importantly, we're focused on making sure that these tools are sort of creative co-pilots. But our Firefly tool, I should say, our Firefly tool does create whole cloth new things based on text prompts. And that's important. And we're seeing incredible, if you look at the galleries that people are presenting, same with Stability and others, people are just using their imaginations in ways that they may not have been able to, or at least the technology has unleashed, ways of thinking and ways of typing prompts. But again, understanding what something is a spectrum. I don't think it's going to ever be black and white. You could say that Adobe Photoshop Content Aware Fill has been doing this for decades. You take a brush, you remove something on a photo. There's a level of AI in Content Aware Fill now that far surpasses in sophistication what was done before. And if you're using in-painting or out-painting tools, you could say that's an evolution of that kind of technology, right? Imagining what should be outside the frame or making a film set bigger. Those things are augmentative and they help people realize their visions and creativity. But there is this spectrum of when is it truly created by a machine? When is it partially assisted by a human, or vice versa? And again, we think it's very important that that information be knowable, and that's the transparency.
And so what I've been hearing is this sense that even I'll use me as the example, the artistically inept of us can be creative. And it's a fusion of the sophistication of the output and how easy it is to use the tools. Are there any technical or non-technical skills that are still necessary to be a really, elite or successful creator today? Any gaps, or is that totally dissolved? And I guess maybe Jean, will go to you again. Do you see the difference between people who've picked this up last week and folks who've been working in this in 10 years?
There's definitely still a different, like in any craft, there's a difference between, picking it up last week and working in it for 10 years. I would say a lot of the challenges are I would say the proportion of challenges that are sort of technical in nature is shrinking. That's not to say that there's no technical challenges. There's still ways to go. I think, even 4 years ago, you sort of really needed to have some baseline kind of programmer like skills, being able to at least use a terminal. If you go back 10 years, you had to be basically like in computer science to use these tools. Now there's maybe less of that, but the thing is that there's a lot of intangible skills that are going into this. I can tell you that I've been, working with these tools as long as anyone, but I'm terrible at prompting. I really don't, there's a certain craft that comes to just endless experimentation and kind of beginning to understand, how to whisper to these models in some sense. And besides for that, it's a lot of it is, it's a little bit like alchemy. There's almost no science that you could really follow to get good at how to make these, make images from these or anything from them. You have to kind of experiment and see what works for you. You hop into this Discord, and some people have figured out like, hey, if you change these hyperparameters a little bit like this, and then these prompts work a lot better. It's really kind of like alchemy. And then having a certain, and this I think aligns a lot with traditional creators. It's really the same thing. It's kind of knowing your audience, knowing what people respond to, and a lot of that stuff is not something that you could learn if you're just focusing on the programming. And so a lot of people think it's all sort of automatic, but in reality, these things take just as much time to get good at as pretty much anything else. A lot of experimentation. And so while I think the technical part will never be zero, but it's certainly going to be the case that at some point it's almost like computer literacy. There used to be a time when that you were specialized if you were using the internet, and now it feels like pretty much everyone can use the internet. I think we'll get to that point as well, but there will always be a little bit of the two, in tandem.
Any other thoughts on that gap?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Prompting, has been so successful because linguistics is the way that the human race has communicated for thousands of years, right? So this is the interface that we've developed first for these models, but it does have limitations, right? And we're seeing, as a result of the open source community, we're seeing controllability now be a huge focus for the users of the models and the tools. And we're seeing people create things like ControlNet and T2I that allow you to very much more specifically control how the image is created. And that will just increase, and those kinds of better ways of controlling the model will become embedded in tools that become creative suites like Photoshop and these other platforms where that you see this technology start to become part of that daily tool set. So I think we're looking at prompting as kind of the way that we're going to interface with it is there's going to be more to it for sure. So yeah, the technical ability of the artist is still going to be hugely important in making the most of all those different ways of interacting with the model.
So with this in mind, do you sense that there'll be any upending of marketplaces? We hear a lot about the implications on jobs or industries, and the ones that come to mind are professional photography, illustration, other creative vocations. Andy, any thoughts?
Many thoughts. I do think this is an area that we need to see play out. I think, with any major technical revolution, there are changes in the distribution of opportunity, and I think we probably will see that. Hard to say if it's, upside on the average for everyone involved, or if there's some downside and there's some opportunity lost. I think we're going to see that very soon, and in some cases we're already seeing it. Obviously, in the Adobe community, we have a lot of concerned parties who are both excited for the opportunity, and also a little trepidatious about what it means for their livelihoods. And that's totally understandable. The demand for more and more digital content in marketing circles, in creative circles, is insatiable, and it's only growing, with social media and other places to market, and find opportunity. So, we think, any kind of AI or automation or generative AI can help people produce more and work more efficiently. And that's kind of the all boats rising kind of scenario. And I think we're beginning to see that as well. Long term, in 10 years, if you ask me what will this all look like in 10 years, I think there are new skill sets to attain. And it's going to stretch artists and creators of all kinds to attain them and figure out how to use them to their best advantage. People a few weeks ago even were talking, or a couple months ago, were talking about prompt engineering being a major in college. That sounded right for a minute, right? Now, fast forward to what Tom said, which I think is spot on. Tools are going to do some of that kind of drudgery of changing hyperparameters and, rewriting or augmenting prompts behind the scenes, because those things are the machine language of generative AI, to some extent. Just like you don't really need to know HTML to understand the web or the internet. It's there, but you probably shouldn't even understand what a URL is. Those things are like the machine language that enable things to work. And I think prompt engineering, as it was called, is kind of that. So as tools get easier to use, more democratized, it remains to be seen how people use them to best advantage. And I think the artists and practitioners and communicators who do that with tools like Adobe Firefly and our stuff and Stable Diffusion and what Gene is creating, will have more opportunity. But it really is in the hands of the individual creator to take advantage of these things. And it's going to be an interesting, I keep saying interesting few years. It's always going to be an interesting few months in this particular area because of the velocity with which things are moving.
And I'm wondering, beyond the creatives, or I guess like Eugene, or we have a lot of folks presumably on this session who think about storytelling in a different way with news and truth and journalism. What safeguards, maybe it could be expanding upon provenance, but what safeguards do you think should be in place to prevent the concerning abuses of generative AI? And we'll see who wants to go first.
Maybe I'll fill that. I can try. I think it depends a little bit on the context. So, let's say in social media or something, I think, I think in the future, when in the early internet, to make an analogy, it was a little bit unsafe, as people remember computer viruses, that was kind of an issue. And over time, those things, they still exist, but society kind of built up some defense mechanisms. And I think the new norm in the future will be that, that you simply understand that anyone can make a piece of content purporting to be, anyone doing anything else. And that you'll learn that the trust layer will have to come in the form of things like digital signatures. Let's say, you really want to give agency to the humans. I want to sign off on pictures of myself, let's say. And I think something like that is probably inevitable. In the context of news, that's a lot harder, and probably outside of my area, so I can't comment on it too much. But certainly similar principles apply. Like you really want to be able to. There's trust is the most important thing, and you want people that are implicated to have agency in this. And so I would say in all the media there needs to be safeguards like that, probably first and foremost.
Tom?
Yeah.
Please.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, there are obvious examples where, especially with the automation of the kind of amplification of information, that you get on social networks. So someone can post an image somewhere, and it gets amplified due to the algorithm, and suddenly that image is being spread over, you know, all over the internet, right? So maybe that there's some kind of transition, exactly as Gene says, to, you know, a more trust-based system that's inside that amplification model that seeks to verify the image before it's spread, right? You know, rather than it just being assumed that the content is, you know, by its very nature authentic. So that's what the CAI, the CTPA, you know, protocol does, right? Is it embeds that information directly into the image to give those social networks the ability to kind of build that into their algorithms, which I think is particularly important. But yeah, I would say trust is going to be a big thing on that.
Andy.
Yeah, it's huge. And I think we spent a lot of time today talking already about kind of power to creators, responsible use of tools like stability and other things. We haven't spent too much time talking about the potential perils of what this means for actual information and disclosure of news. So I think, you know, there are many things to consider here, but if you look at the work that folks like Leica and Nikon and others are doing with the CI open source, it is important in some instances to show provenance all the way back to the beginning. And it's easy to say, well, you know, computational photography, the photons that hit the sensor may not even hit the sensor before they're modified. But, you know, we have to draw the line somewhere. We have to say, understanding that this came from a camera and was not manipulated, or shadows were punched up and that was a non-editorial decision made by the Associated Press or the BBC, and that's okay. But as soon as we start talking about whether something is okay or not, my feeling is that whether it's okay or not should be pushed all the way to the consumer, right? If you think that somebody's made an editorial decision about how something is depicted or added an ingredient into a composite, you should know that. But we also have to respect our news institutions, who know a lot more about storytelling and truth, if you trust them, than many individual consumers. So there's a balance to be struck. And there are some easy things that can be done. For example, if something purports to have come from your favorite news organization, let's take the BBC, for example, simply knowing that this cryptographically verifiably did come from the BBC is really powerful. So that brings with it a date stamp and the fact that it was blessed, for lack of a better term, by the BBC. If you trust the BBC's sourcing methods and approach the information integrity, that goes a long way. You know, if we had that on the internet right now and on social media, I do think we'd be in a ostensibly better position to understand and have a shared objective sense of what's true, now that every one of us is a newscaster and a broadcaster. And it's hard to pay attention, not only to, we know, and Claire knows well, people around the world who are on social media, who have privileged access to those platforms, do share things that fit their worldview without much regard for what those things are. And also, frankly, without, and I include myself in this group, by the way, without regard for the hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of downstream viewers that get to see that media by way of amplification, as Tom mentioned. If those downstream consumers could understand that I shared it and a little bit about what it is, if it purports to be news, I think we would be a lot better off. And we will have that soon, thanks to efforts like the CTPA.
Thanks, everyone. And it's interesting, in our role at PAI, we interface with policymakers asking big questions about generative media, and oftentimes that's through the lens of AI regulation or AI policy, and where a lot of us, or at least I'm curious if you agree with me, but a lot of us are looking to some of the, we won't go into detail because we're not lawyers, though I wish I was in this instance, the Section 230 case around just like who's responsible, how do we treat different responsible parties who might now be information mediators or publishers, is setting precedent almost retroactively for the social media era. And at the same time, it will inform, presumably, the development of responsibility and institutional roles in AI development and the need for disclosure and other variables. So just an interesting area to pay attention to if you're curious about the future of policymaking that will implicate probably the development and dissemination of these systems. So we'll go to a lightning round before we kick it over to the Q&A from the audience. So each of you, and we'll go Tom, Gene, and then Andy. In less than a minute each, please, though it's hard, if 3 things could be different about the generative AI field in a year's time, what would you want them to be? Starting with Tom.
Okay, 3 things. Well, look, I think firstly that we are able to continue releasing open source models. There's a lot of pressures on that at the moment. And we're trying to work through those very carefully and make sure we do things the right way and be, responsible with everything that we do. And that we really feel it's important for that to continue, right? To continue to democratize the industry and give these tools away. So that's definitely number one. I guess number two, that we have, a better understanding of the technology. At the moment, there's still a lot of fear mongering and misunderstanding and all of that, that hype that goes around. So settling that conversation and really proving that this is something that benefits society, I think, is something that I'd love to see happen. And I guess with new modalities, the third thing, right, is that we apply those learnings to new modalities. So we're going to see the same conversations happening with audio, music, with video, and in some ways it's kind of even more. Video, you can think of all the reasons why it's even bigger conversation with that. So hopefully the same learnings and the same things that we're going through now to develop these tools and understandings can be applied those other modalities. Yeah.
I would say I'd love to see kind of more interoperability and composability. So I'd like to be able to, generate assets in one platform and then take those to an otherwise independent platform with the attribution and provenance intact and do something there with them, and keeping all of the same parties in the loop so that, we create these more sort of positive sum interactions. Second thing I would say is for traditional digital artists, if it's a funny thing to even say, but for artists to have some agency in this process, to feel like they have a way of interfacing with it. I think a lot of the reaction against it has been really, just a ramification of them not feeling like they have a role in it. And I do know, I think there are a number of people that are thinking deeply about this problem and trying to figure out ways that artists can get, attribution or some agency in this process, maybe compensation even. That's the second thing. And the third thing, maybe just lower hardware barriers. Maybe I'd love to be able to, there's been a lot of excitement over kind of self-hosted language models. That's really exciting. It's been really GPT-3 or GPT-4 or nothing else for a long time, and I think that's beginning to change. And so those are three of the many things that I could say I'd love to see by next year.
Andy?
Yeah, there are 100 things I could put on my list, but I'll choose the ones that won't surprise anyone. I do think a year is a good time frame and lens to look at this, because we have many elections throughout the world, but close to home, the U.S. election coming at us. The election cycle is effectively already started. So within a year's time, and in time to have impact on the U.S. election that's upcoming, the presidential election, I hope we see broad adoption of CAI and provenance, open source, open standards. This is the way to move forward with a secure way to understand what things are, as we've been discussing. The second kind of leg of that stool is media literacy, and this is very ambitious to consider what can be done in a year. But gone are the days of several months ago where you could look at the two ears on your subject in a photograph and say, "Oh, this was generated by DALL-E 2 because the earring on one ear doesn't match what's on the other ear. The eyes are a little skewed." We're about to cross the chasm, or some would argue we already have, that full of photorealism, something that's truly non-discernible from reality, is possible to come out of these generative tools. So I think we need a new kind of media literacy, and I'd like to see that well underway within a year's time, so that it can have impact in the election cycle. And lastly, to get provenance technology into the hands of storytellers who are trying to tell stories that need to be heard in a creative way, but also in a critically important way in areas of the world where it may be hard to get news out in a truthful way, and where, while we can never attest to the veracity of what is depicted in an image or a video, we can trust the photographer, the organization, and the cryptographic, the mathematics that allow us to connect trust to media. And that's not a perfect, kind of measurable answer, but if we make progress against the three of those in the next year, I will take a short vacation and come back to it.
Not too long. We'll ask you for 2025 too, the same question.
Right.
So to audience Q&A, I'll go in the order they were fed to me. And none are directed to anyone specific, but the first question is, are you all thinking about, and maybe this is for Andy, a direct full integration of CAI into creator tools like Stable Diffusion, Firefly, maybe even in terms of the obligation to mark AI imagery?
Yeah, I'll speak about Firefly and give Tom an opportunity to talk about what Stable Diffusion is doing. So if you use Firefly now, you'll see there's even a very obvious little pop-up that says applying content credentials when you download something from Firefly. And what's happening behind the scenes is exactly what we've been describing. So those files that you get from Firefly are imbued with content credentials with CAI metadata. We also store that data in the Adobe Content Credentials Cloud with no connection to the individual, but if metadata is stripped, to demonstrate that it can be reattached using a fingerprinting technique to say, if you were to post this on certain social media platforms that will happily strip that data off, this is actually more robust than just file-based provenance. So we're doing both of those with Firefly. Again, no attribution to any particular individual, simply that Firefly was used, and importantly, the model version that was used, so that we can track back if there are issues with bias. Like we know that simple prompts tend to cause more biased output when you type in something like lawyer and get a preponderance of images with male subjects. So understanding what version was used to create a certain output we think is important to track back and understand what's actually happening. Tom?
Yeah, so we're really excited. We just started our implementation of the Adobe CAI just recently, and we're going to have this launched very soon into our API. So it will be opt-in. We think it's important to let people decide initially whether they want to enable it or not, and that will be at the user level or the organization level if you're an enterprise that's using the API. We're discussing with Adobe how to include that in the open source release of future models. And with everything open source, they can always be removed, which is one of the good things about it as well. We're not looking at forcing this on anyone, but we do see it as a really important thing to enable people to include it when they want to. And it's also from the perspective of the teams and the creators of the models. There are many different people working on this, and this is a way to identify, as you said, which version of the model, which team was behind the model, potentially what data sets we used. So there's a lot of reasons that this is a really good step forward, and we're excited to be engaging, and we should have it delivered very soon.
Yeah, it's a big point of importance for Eden. So we're trying to make a system where everything that's, or at least a subset, there is possibly some opt-in, opt-out kind of dynamics at play, but the thing that I'm most interested in is some subset of what's created on Eden can be validated and sort of verified and reproduced. So given the pointer to a particular code base and a model checkpoint and an input specification, including a random seed, that you can actually prove that you can basically regenerate that same asset, and that would aid composability and interoperability, which are things that are important to me, that I think would create some of these positive sum abilities among platforms if they were to adopt something similar, and that there's basically this would be our provenance layer. And so I'm thinking a lot about it. I think there's still a lot of open questions. I'm kind of drafting an article right now about it that I hope to release at the end of this month. It helps me kind of think through the process, because it's even to ask the right questions is still even tricky in such an open-ended subject. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to make a push and get this to be a lot more standard in the future.
So there are two questions about the data that are inputs to these systems. So one asks about whether or not authenticity and transparency in this realm also includes disclosing how the data was acquired and from whom, not just whether an image or text is AI generated. Whoever wants to take that.
Yeah, I can take that from a standards perspective. So the answer is yes, certainly the specification supports that. And one of the things I didn't highlight in my opening about the 1.3 C2PA open technical specification is that it begins to contemplate broader applications of AI and ML. And I think in the 1.4 spec, which will be the next release, obviously, there will be the notion of actually creating provenance for models themselves. So you can imagine that if you use Firefly or something like it, have a model version, a kind of vendor in a version, maybe you download the model itself to use on your own. Maybe you license it from a vendor. It is possible to know what training data was used to make that. Now, how far we track back, understanding what individual images may have been used for training, more about the algorithm. All of this is possible. I think it remains to be seen how purveyors and vendors of these technologies use this. But if the question is it possible? The answer is yes. How this will manifest in practice, I think just like any standard, it remains to be seen. Adobe's committed to applying provenance, throughout the stack where it makes sense, without saying anything of future business models. But we know that other members of the C2PA do, who are working on this many hours per week, do intend to decorate their models with provenance specifically for the models themselves.
Thanks, Andy. And a follow-up related to this question of the data inputs for people whose images might be scraped, and I think someone alluded to I think, Andy, you talked about this a little bit earlier on. Are there ways to prevent your images from being incorporated into these data sets that are resilient today?
Yeah. So I can take that on. So obviously, Stable Diffusion is probably one of the few image models where we're completely open about where the data came from. Obviously, work with Lion and the data sets there, the 5B to 2B. And it is a bit concerning that we're seeing definitely a trend now of image models being developed where the data sets are kept very secret and private, and we're not able to see where that data came from. So we're obviously supportive of that. And then to answer your question, we've been working with a group. The URL is haveibeentrained.com. You can opt out now of future versions of the data set. So we're training new versions of Stable Diffusion that will respect all of those opt-outs. We've had a lot of people already put in their names already, both from company and kind of artist level. So yeah, this is definitely something that's hugely important. And I think the spotlight's been on Stable Diffusion, right? Because the data was open source, and that's a good thing. We would definitely embrace that.
Yeah, and the specification affordance I mentioned earlier that Claire alluded to is a do not train assertion in the C2PA standard that's in the 1.3 spec that was recently published. And you'll see some tools coming out from Adobe that exercise it. So that effectively says, in addition to all the other CAI data that you can cryptographically attach to an image or a video or an audio file or a stream, there is this notion of do not train. It's a little more complex and nuanced than that because there are different kinds of training that could be allowed or disallowed. But I hope to see this adopted broadly, including by the folks at Have Been Trained at Swanning, who Tom works with, because they are kind of the nexus of where all these technologies can come together. What we provide there is the ability for that intent to travel wherever that asset goes. Whether you find it on the original website, whether somebody wants to decorate all images downloaded from an agency with that, that should be possible. And I feel very strongly, as does the team, that this kind of agency should be in the hands of creators. That there should be a decision making and a mechanism or multiple mechanisms for them to express this. So I would say stay tuned. Again, you'll see real tools coming out from us, and adoption will take time. But the answer is there is a way. Is it effective right now as we would like it to be? Not quite, but we'll get there quickly.
And our last question, maybe one of you can answer. I know it's a different modality, and we talked about a need to intervene and add transparency maybe in different ways for different modalities. But someone asks about the panel's take on the new AI generated musical works that are mimicking well-known artists like Drake, more so from the perspective of monetization on user-generated content platforms. Does anyone want to take that in 30 seconds? An easy area to sum up.
I haven't seen.
Gene, go for it.
Yeah, I actually I think the Drake thing was really recent. I haven't heard it yet myself. I heard just a lot of people talking about Drake and AI recently. So if someone can send me a link. But yeah, with music, I mean, historically we've seen that the players in the music ecosystem are historically, pretty antagonistic towards even just remix culture, and so I feel there's going to be a lot of questions to answer there. Musicians are the most remix oriented, I think, of the artists, and there's just a lot of creativity that's opened when we have systems that permit that, and some acceptance of that. And so I'd really love to see standards kind of applied there. I'm aware of different projects that are trying to create, let's say, novel kinds of royalty streams based on remixing that, which can actually downstream compensate the artists who are being remixed, and I think that might go a long way. I don't necessarily have a strong opinion on the exact mechanism. I feel like it's a question for other people, but it would be a tragedy if it becomes difficult to do those things. There's a lot of latent creativity that comes from having ways of allowing that.
Thanks, Jean. And I know Drake will moderate the next panel, but until then, I want to thank our guests, Jean, Tom, Andy. It was such a joy to learn from all of you, and to CAI and C2PA that are moving this field forward. I look forward to staying in touch with all of you and the community as well. And I'll pass it to Andy to share 20 seconds more about next steps for this group.
Claire's an expert moderator, giving me exactly 20 seconds, and thank you for that. That's the right thing to do. Claire, I want to thank you for fantastic panel moderation, for your insights. Stay tuned on the CAI event space. So we have something coming up in May that you'll hear more about, presenting more details about the 1.3 spec for those who are interested, including the upcoming model provenance and AI/ML related topics that we've discussed. We're also going to showcase some members that are implementing CAI and C2PA with Adobe open source. There's some amazing things coming with audio and some recognizable names there. If you want to stay informed and you're not already on the newsletter, please sign up. And I always encourage people to actually become CAI members. Everything we do is open. There's a Discord channel. If you become a member, you'll get the newsletter and other things. But effectively, this is a way of saying, hey, my company, my college, I personally, as a photographer and artist, endorse this idea of provenance. So it's easy to get in, it's free, and we'd love to have more folks among those 1,000, especially those who are willing to implement and move the field forward. So I want to thank you, everyone. See you on Discord in the meantime, and hopefully again next month. Thanks again to our wonderful panelists and Claire for moderating. See you soon.
Thanks.